attending. Thank you very much for attending. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today's topic, it sounds a little bit dry, intelligent process map, but hopefully it'll be a little more interesting than it sounds. So first of all, let me just say that I developed the intelligent process map over approximately a 10-year period as part of my process improvement practice. So it took me quite a while to come up with this. You may not find references to it anywhere else. So let's get into it. So first of all, before I get into the actual process map, I want to make sure that we're synchronized in terms of what is a process, because this is process mapping. So it's a way of representing a process. So first of all, I want you to think of, for this presentation at least, think of a process as a factory. You have a demand or a request at one end, and at the other end, you have a response. A simple example would be a pizzeria. A pizzeria, you ask for a pizza, and it goes through the factory, and out the other end comes your delicious pizza already prepared. But what if we look inside the factory? What is inside this process factory? Well, first of all, you would see actors. So actors are the entities that do the work. And there are two kinds of actors. There are people who are playing a role. So the pizzaiolo would be an actor. And then there's technology. So for example, the oven that cooks the pizza, that's a technology function. Technology is also an actor because it performs a particular role. Now, what else would we see in this factory? Well, we would see the product in progress. So you might see a piece of dough, then you might see that dough being stretched, then you might see that dough with the toppings on it, then you might see the same dough coming out of the oven already cooked. So think of that as the product in progress. If you go into any factory, you will see product in process as well as actors. And finally, you're going to see activity. You're going to see people kneading dough. You're going to see people stretching. If we abstract the activity, that's method. So when we talk about method, it's an abstraction of the activity. And that's why I want to think of a process as a factory, because method and process are different things, even though quite often they're used interchangeably. So a method is static. A method is a description of the steps. And therefore, the only thing you can say about a method is whether you conform to it or you don't conform to it, whether you follow it or not. So it's a partial picture of the factory. A process, on the other hand, is dynamic. A process is experienced through transactions and through performance. So the process as a whole, end to end, is based on performance, if you want to understand it. And the performance is tied to the stakeholders. So what is IPMAP? Well, IPMAP, Intelligent Process Mapping, it's a framework for designing, understanding, and specifying the process factory, the whole factory, and its performance. It's also a framework for communicating and sharing that understanding with other people in an objective way. Of course, you can also use it to describe the method being used by the process, but you can use it for much more. So let's look at the fundamentals. Well, first of all, legacy process mapping. In case you don't know, it's over 100 years old. It was presented first in 1921, although it was used even before that, by Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. Basically, legacy mapping is procedural and it's synchronous. It's a method map with control flow. It was originally designed and developed for simple manufacturing environment, not complex or knowledge processes. And it doesn't specify the process, it primarily describes the method. Intelligent process mapping, on the other hand, is not procedural, it's declarative, it's an asynchronous model, and does not have control flow. It's also normalized. It's a relational model. So it produces a model that has high cohesion, low coupling, like a relational data model. And it connects not just work, A legacy process mapping is basically about the work, the tasks. It connects the work or task to the outputs that are produced, to the outcomes, and to the performance. So the whole process. So what is IP map really about? It's not about drawing diagrams, although you do have to draw diagrams, but it's primarily about, well, like real estate, communication, communication, communication. First of all, with ourselves. So it's a way of making sure that we can look at a picture and say, is that really what I understand about the process? The second one is about communication with others, other people, colleagues, other people on the team. And lastly, it's about communicating with the process itself, because of the lot of the information, insights that we can get about a process can only come from the process, not necessarily from other people. Okay, so a little bit of synchronization. This is a process map. This is not an IP map. This is a legacy map of building this little tank here that you see. And obviously you're not meant to read all of this, but what you see here is an extract. So this is one portion of it where we're attaching this block to this block, and this is the information. So this is a typical process map. Now your process maps will be more elaborate. They'll have more figures on it. You might use different models, but basically it's a procedural, prescriptive map that maps the method, and it has control flow. So here you can go forwards and you can also go backwards. It's a monolithic tool for recording direct observations. And I'm sure you've all seen the kind of huge maps on walls with lots of these little diagrams on them. And you also know that they're not so easy to modify because it's a monolithic model. So let's look at what this would look like on an actual IP map. So this is a legacy process map, and this is what a map looks like as an IP map. So you can see that it's quite different. First of all, it's very modular. It consists of a canvas. So if you think of a canvas as like a wall, and it has a bunch of panels. So if you've ever gone into a museum, you might have a wall with a lot of different paintings, and they all might depict a point in history. So the point is, all of these panels are telling a story. They're telling a story about the product that's being produced. So here we have the master panel, and the master panel is kind of a table of contents into the rest of the map. And then you have detailed panels, and there are other panels besides these. And unlike a legacy map, which focuses on work and tasks, here we have 3 tiers. So these rectangles, they depict work. So when we go inside one of these, what we're going to see is tasks. This, with the rounded edges, that depicts an output. And this depicts outcomes. So you have work, which leads to outputs, which leads to outcomes. So the idea of the master panel, it's showing you how the product or how the primary output progresses. And then this is the work required to do it. So each combination of output and work is a segment, and each segment can be exploded into a new panel. So I'll look at one of these panels, this one here. So first of all, a panel is these look like swim lanes, but they're not swim lanes. Swim lanes are really showing tasks and who does them. This is a normalized model. It's showing different kind of work in different streams. So work streams, you see there are 3 work streams here, the green, the yellow, the red. The throughput stream is the work required to actually produce your primary output. You can kind of think of it like the value add concept, but not quite the same. The failure stream is the work required to handle failures that happen during the process. And the control stream consists of work required that we put into place in order to try to prevent or reduce failures. So this is an overview a part of an IP map. Now I'm going to go into each one of these in detail so that we understand how do you start a process map and an IP map and how do you carry it through. Okay? So, first of all, we always start with the master panel. And the point of the master panel is, first of all, to show how does the primary output progress from beginning to end. So you can see here it's a physical output. You can see that we go from this stage to this stage to this stage to this stage, and then we're finished. So this shows from beginning, from receiving a demand to the completion of the demand, how the output progresses. Now, for each output or output state, you might say, we're going to define work. So associated with each one of these outputs is the work required to go from here, from this state, to here, to this state. So basically, this shows a beginning to end process, and it depicts the progression of the primary output. And as you can see, because we're defining work based on output, it's really an output-centered work breakdown structure, which if you look in PMBOK describes project management plan as being a deliverable-centered work breakdown structure, which is actually the same thing. Okay, so if you were doing a project, you could produce an IP map as well, because this is an output-centered work breakdown structure. So you're defining all of the work required to produce a certain output or deliverable. Now, one big difference between IP map and a regular process map is that a process map tends to be a story told from the point of view of the actors, so the users, right? So it's a user-centered map. We even talk about user stories. This is a product-centered or output-centered map. So it's the story told from the point of view of the output. So the output is saying, this is what's happening to me from beginning to end. So it's telling you its story, not from the user perspective, but from the output's perspective, which is a very big difference in terms of the meaning of the map and what goes into the map. You'll also notice that it flows in one direction. So it's more like a project plan because it flows in a single direction. You don't see loopbacks like you do in a process map. And that's because we don't put control flow in here. It's a declarative model. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Okay, so we've got our master panel. And so this is the beginning to end for this particular output. Now, for each combination of work and output, we call that a segment, the segment of this process. And each segment can be expanded by an additional panel, a work panel. So let's have a look. What happens when we expand this particular panel, for example, rear block assembly? Okay, so here we go. When we expand it, we're going to describe here the work. So this is the attached rear block. This is a part of the whole process. We're doing an output work breakdown structure, and we've got three different streams. And the work in the three streams is a different kind of work. So the throughput stream is the work necessary to produce the primary output or product. The failure stream depicts all of the things that can go wrong. So they're the failure handlers, if you think of it that way. And the control stream is what you put in place to try to reduce or prevent the failure. So everything in here happens before the failure occurs. Everything in here happens after the failure occurs. And you keep that separate. So the only way to increase the throughput of a process is in here. Everything in here is work, but it doesn't produce more throughput. So let's look at each one of these in detail to get a better idea of what we're actually putting in here. So the throughput stream, let's look at that. The throughput stream has two kinds of activities: transform work and logistics. So what does that mean? So in the building of this, for example, when we actually touch the product, whatever it is that you're making, the output, if you're coding, if you're producing software, that is actually touching the primary output and transforming it. So that's what transform is. Transform is work that touches the primary output and changes it and moves it closer to its final form. So transform work increases throughput, not value. So this is not the same as value-added work. Value-added work is, we're saying that tasks actually increase value, and therefore you ask the question, would a customer pay for this, to determine whether it's value or non-value? And in this model, we're saying we never actually ask customers if a particular task increases value, because the customer doesn't know how we make the product. A customer places value not on the work, but on the product. But what we can do is we can determine whether a particular task increases throughput, meaning creates more stuff that we're trying to create, or moves it closer to its end state. So that's the transform part of this. The other part is there's work that touches the product, but doesn't move it closer to its final form. So example, let's take the pizza example. If you're shaping the dough and making it into a 12-inch pizza, for example, that's transform work. You can see the difference between the lump of dough and the shaped dough. When we finally top it and put it in the oven, cooking it or baking it, that's transform work. It actually modifies the product and brings it closer to its final form. Actually, it brings it to its final form. But what is logistics? Well, when you move that pizza from the paddle into the oven, you have to touch the product. You have to pick it up. You have to move it. That's logistics. You have to do that, but that doesn't move it closer to its final form. So in here, we take this work. This is from the regular process map. We take these four and we put them in here. So this shows the work. We've now normalized it. We see that we get the base, that's this. We position the rear block, that's this. We put the bolt in, but if we stop here and we let it go, this would fall apart. So it's not, this is all logistics. It's work required to prepare the product or the output to move to its next stage. But when we finally fasten the bolt, that moves it to this stage. This is transform work. So in a real process, most of the work, or very little of the work, will be transform. A lot of the work will be logistics. And of course, some will be failure and control. Okay, so that's what the throughput stream is. Now, what does MVP mean? Minimum viable process. If this process was perfect, excuse me, and nothing ever went wrong, you wouldn't need the failure stream. There would be no failures to fix. And so you would not need a control stream. So I call this the minimum viable process. That's the least amount of effort that would be required to make this process a reality, would be whatever's in the throughput stream. All right, so let's move on to the failure stream. So things go wrong when you're producing anything. So failure describes what can go wrong. And it specifies the action or work that we need to take after the failure occurs. So in the example that we had before, in the control process, you can see that here we're checking, is the rear aligned? So is this aligned? If it's not aligned, we consider that an error, and we do a bunch of stuff, and then we go backwards. And then we check the same thing. Are the sides aligned? And if it's not, we fix something and we go back. So these are failures, things that went wrong that we have to fix. So the first thing we do here in terms of an IP map is we identify the failure. We don't yet define what we do, but we identify this whole thing as a process failure outcome. So here we have two failure outcomes, rear alignment failure and a side alignment failure. So we first identify them. We see it's a different symbol here. So you have output symbol, this is an outcome symbol, and this is a work symbol. So this specifies the action to be taken after the failure occurs. So if we want to specify the action, we need another panel for this. So for example, here's a potential panel for this. Rear alignment. So here we can see that this is from the process map. We loosen the rear block, we align and refasten. Here we have the test. So we specify at a minimum, what is the test that tells us that a failure has happened? And what do we do when the failure happens? But we can also specify more, which we can't specify in a typical process map. Here we specify what's the cost of this error. Every time this error occurs, how much does it cost us? What is the delay, for example? So every time a failure occurs, it's going to be a delay in the overall completion of this particular primary output. And we can specify other things as well. We can specify who does it, what kind of skills are required. So this is an example of another panel. And we would have a similar one for the side alignment. So we've seen the throughput panel defines the work required to produce the primary output. Here we identify the failures that happen, and then for each one, we have a panel that describes what do you do when the failure occurs. What about control stream? Control stream is very important because in actual fact, many processes have more controls than actual work. So the question we ask is, to reduce or prevent failure, what can you do? So first of all, you can harden the throughput. That's the first thing you should do. Make the throughput less likely to produce the failure. So in our pizza example, we might discover that we're getting errors in our pizzas. They're being undercooked. And we might conclude that the reason for that is that the pizzaiolo is not experienced enough to know when the pizza is ready. So we might harden the output by training one of the actors or many of the actors. So that's what I mean by harden. You don't actually put any control in place. You fix the issue inside here. But if you can, once you've done that, if there's still a potential for failures, then you might say, okay, can I implement a control? So for each failure, we can, at the beginning, simply identify that there might be a control. So we give it the same name, rear alignment failure. We're going to have a potential rear alignment control, but we don't know yet because we haven't looked at it. So for each failure or complication, there's going to be one or more potential controls to reduce or prevent. Again, the idea is we're trying to limit the amount of time we spend here, maximize the amount of time we spend in here, because this is what produces throughput. Now, for each control, and control is a burden, control always requires some sort of investment. So we want to know, what is the control? Example, if we decide to do walkthroughs in the case of producing software, then that's going to have a certain cost. And is it going to be effective? So we want to measure, if we do walkthroughs, how many errors will we catch so that we prevent? And what is the cost of the control versus what is the benefit in reduced failure? Because sometimes you put in a control and the cost of the control can be higher than the cost of simply letting the failure happen and fixing it. So failure is always negative. It always sucks energy from your process. It reduces productivity. Throughput is always positive. It increases throughput through your process. Control can be positive or negative in the sense that it can be negative if the control is not effective or not cost beneficial. So you put it in, but it doesn't reduce failure by more than the cost of the control. On the other hand, if it does reduce the failure by more than the cost of the control, then you're freeing up work from here that you can move down to here. So that's why controls, you have to be very careful with them because they're either positive or negative. Failures, you have no choice but to handle the failure. So that's the basic throughput control and failure aspect of it. Now, the last item that I'm going to discuss is the concept of performance. Without performance, the map is not intelligent. It's a better map, I think, better way of representing it, but really performance is the thing that makes communicating with the process the final goal. So what does performance mean? Performance means that at each point of output, we identify some sort of dashboard to measure. So in this case, we're measuring two simple things: start to finish time, how much time elapsed from when we were ready to work on this to when we finished, and how many defects. Now, how is that helpful? Well, look over here. In this case, we're saying that for a complete order, we had 25 failures, of which 2 went to the customer. So that's a big number. So we might say, hey, you know what? I want to reduce the failures by hardening the output, but where are the failures coming from? Well, we see that there are 16 failures coming from here. So this would say, maybe we should do a continuous process improvement on this segment of the process. And therefore, we would go into more detail here and identify, well, what are the errors? So in this case, we've identified the errors that there are 3 basic errors, and that this one's the highest. Now you notice here that the throughput stream is kind of faded. What that means is that you don't necessarily need to define the throughput stream. If you have users that know the process, which you always do, you might be able to analyze the failures without resorting to actually documenting this part of the process. So that's another aspect of the IP map, is you don't necessarily have to start with the throughput stream. You can start with the failure stream. You can never start with the control stream, because the control stream depends on that. So now that you know where the errors are, you can then work to eliminate these errors, make a change, and then when you rerun your process, see if you've actually made a change in the performance. Okay, so this is the base of the IP model. It's not the whole model, but this is sufficient to replace legacy process mapping and add performance. It's not sufficient to represent other aspects such as skills, conditions, side effects, etc. But any legacy process model that you have can be converted to an IP map through normalization, which is essentially what I've done. Is I've taken a process map, legacy, and I've converted it to an IP map as I've gone through the example. So normalization is quite simple. You determine the primary output and you produce one IP map for each primary output in your legacy map. Then you create the throughput stream by extracting the tasks that are throughput. You go through and identify all of the failure work that is in your process map, and you identify and name each failure, and then you add one control outcome for each of the failures. And then you can add the master panel and you can add performance. IP map is really a way of communicating more than anything else, not just making a drawing. It's very modular compared to regular process mapping. It's declarative and relational, and it's reimagined for complex and knowledge-based processes. It's simpler to develop, maintain, modify, and understand, and it does not depend on methodologies. It's independent of any methodology you will be using. It's also suitable for projects, because if you think about it, a project is a deliverables-based work breakdown structure, and this is an output-based work breakdown structure, which is the same thing. It's the next generation visual tool for process and project professionals. So I would recommend that you try it out on a simple project or a simple process where you already have a process map, and just try to try to modify that map to normalize it, to make it look like an IP map, and see what additional insights you can get from it. That would be an easy exercise if you already have a map. If you don't, then you can start a new process very simply, or take an example process to try and create one. But I'll tell you, the most difficult thing with the IP map is determining the outputs, because we're not used to thinking in terms of the output progression. We're used to thinking in terms of work progression. That will be the point where you will have the greatest difficulty, just to let you know in advance. So that's it for the presentation per se. As I've said, it's not the whole map, it's not the whole model, but it is the equivalent of process mapping legacy. You can switch to an IP map with this information that you have. So any questions? I will be taking questions. Also, if you have any follow-up questions, please email me at ipmap.baratta@gmail.com. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions. If you want to learn more about it, you can always read the book. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Angela. That was great. So question time, guys. No questions? I guess everybody is pretty clear.
Yeah,
Well, I saw a bunch of hands go up.
Yes, Anish has something to ask. Anish?
Sorry, I'm not hearing anything.
Anish, we are not able to hear you. Okay, Praveen?
Yeah, thank you. I see that this process map is more suitable for regular operations. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. And I would like to know how this could be used in a project management scenario.
Okay,
yeah, thank you.
Okay, so two questions. First of all, it's suitable for any kind of process, whether it's manufacturing, software development, wherever you have a process factory, you're producing something, whether it's something hard or something soft, you can use it. In terms of a project management environment, the bottom part, the throughput, looks very much like a project plan, right? Because you have a deliverable-based work breakdown structure. The way you can use it for a project, the way I use it is, I add the failure modes. It's very important for me when I'm on a project is to think of failure. And failure is, quality, risk, optimization. So what are the things that can go wrong in a particular, related to a particular deliverable in the project? And I define that. You can't necessarily put that on a project plan, but I always usually find a way, depending on the tool that I'm using, to capture what the risks are and what the failure modes are that relate to a particular deliverable. And and then I assign impact. So what is this going to cost me if this risk happens or is realized? Then when that deliverable is produced, if the risk has been realized, then I use that as a way of getting more money for the project, or a way of assigning any risk money that you put aside. So if the risk occurred, then you can say, well, now I'm taking that money and assigning it to the project. If the risk didn't occur, then you say, okay, I don't need the money or the time that was allocated to that risk. So I use it for both projects and processes, because at the end of the day, project factory looks exactly like a process factory. It has actors, it's got product, it has method. Does that answer?
Yes, Angelo, thank you. And one more question. So just to confirm, so that would mean that the control stream is more like our risk register in a project management, and the other one, I forgot its name, failure stream. So failure stream
Yeah.
is more like a issue register, right?
Well, the failure stream is things that can go wrong, right? A control stream, if I look at a project, actually, most of project management is in the control stream because it's things you put in place to try to prevent the failure from happening. And control stream, it's not just about the product. For example, if you think of Scrum or any methodology or waterfall, one of the control stream outcomes, one of the controls is things like scheduling. Well, how do I schedule the work? Do I schedule one activity at a time? Do I allocate the work all at once? That's essentially a control because what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent idle time, for example. So it's a control, even though it's not a quality control, it's optimization control, right? Or if you're producing software and you say we're going to do walkthroughs, that's a control because what you're trying to do is prevent failures from happening when you implement the software. So you're implementing something before the failure to prevent the failure from happening. That is a control. And those things can be validated to see if they're effective or if they're not effective. Is that, did I answer it properly or?
Yes, that did. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. Kirti, you have something to ask? Kirti, you are on mute. Hello, Kirti. Maybe you can type the question. It's okay, Kirti. Maybe you can type your question.
See, this would be a failure, right? And we need a control for it.
Absolutely.
So Praveen liked that.
Yeah, that is a nice one.
We have a live example. I think, Angelo, we are having cascading failures, no messages.
Okay, well, hopefully we fix it for next time.
Hopefully.
So if you've had trouble, which I see some people have, please feel free to email me at the email I gave, and I would be more than happy to answer it.
So the question is, as agile methodology in play, this part IEP map comes as an integral part of review system. Do we still require to intensify this for a better output?
I didn't quite get that. I'm sorry.
So what she's telling is, as agile methodology is in play for most project management principles, IP map also is now part of most of the review systems. So do we still require to intensify this process for a better output?
Yeah, the audio is very bad, so I only caught certain words. Something about Agile, right? Are you asking, is it possible to use this for an Agile project?
No, the question is, yes.
So first of all, so Agile is not a methodology, right? Agile is a umbrella term, so Scrum, etc. So if you have a Scrum project and you want to improve the Scrum project itself or your Scrum process, yes, for sure you can use this methodology in order to improve it. You can use it as part of the retrospective, for example, as long as you bring in intelligence, as long as you have data to help you determine, what to improve. I have in fact used this methodology on software development projects that were Scrum-like to improve the Scrum process. Just to give you an idea, and this goes back a long time, but we used it on we had a project where we went from a waterfall project, 3-month release, 22 people, 135 days turnaround time on requests, to at the end of 4 months, we had a weekly release, which I think is actually better than almost any Scrum project. Weekly release from 22 people to 8 people, from 135-day turnaround to 17-day turnaround, from 50 errors per year to 8 errors per year, using this process in a project, in a process improvement capacity. So you can definitely use it. It doesn't matter what the process is. You can use it on any process, but it takes experience. I wouldn't start with that. I would start with something simple. I hope that answers it. I'm not sure.
So, Kirti, was that okay? Yeah, it's clear for her. We have another question from Kabir. Can you elaborate the improvements for IP map over swim lane again, please?
Can I elaborate on improvements?
For IP map over swim lane again.
Oh, okay. So swim lanes have to do with the work, right? So swim lanes are about who does what. So in an IT map, you can also have swim lanes. If you're in the throughput stream, for example, or even the failure stream, when you like I've shown it as just transform and logistics, but under say logistics, if it's different departments doing the work, you can have swim lanes inside of that if you want, because swim lanes only show departments who does what, whereas the streams is a type of work. It's whether the work is failure work or control work. So you can have swim lanes within each of the 3 streams, if that's what you like. Or what I do usually is, I don't have the screen in front of me. If you look at all the symbols, there's a little rectangle at the bottom. And I usually use the rectangle at the bottom of the symbol to denote where the work is getting done. So you can use either swim lanes or simply put it into the task. Does that clarify? Because all of the symbols have 2 parts, right? They have a big part, which is the name of what's happening inside. And then a little thing at the bottom that's like a little strip. And usually I use that for who does what. Or you can use swim lane.
Yeah, that's also good. Anybody else? Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Angelo. That was a very nice session. So we will share the presentation with the attendees. If you have any further questions, please do contact Mr. Angelo in the email provided. He will be more than happy to explain in detail. And,
yes, please do. And please give me your comments as well, what you thought of the presentation, good or bad. I prefer good, but bad helps more, believe it or not.
Yeah, the feedbacks are what matters most. Please do give us your feedbacks on the presentation, about the speaker, and about the event. This will help us improve for the next one, and also to gain more experience. So next time, please, when you are registering for the event, mention your correct email ID, because even this time, a couple of members email is not the email ID was wrong, so we had to share the details meeting link via WhatsApp. So next time, please do share the correct email ID.